Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 171. This is part 2 of the interview with the writers of Cinefex magazine. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Have you ever sent in your reel wondering why you didn't get the call back? Or what was the reason you didn't get the job? Here's the thing. Most of us think you just put your latest work on your reel to some cool music and send it off, and then you get the job. A lot of us aren't aware that the majority of the reels sent to studios are skipped through and sometimes never even watched in the first place. The fact is, everything we're taught about landing a job as an artist is wrong. Over the past 20 years working for studios like Industrial Light and Magic, Ubisoft, Blur Studio, I built hundreds of teams, hired thousands of artists, and reviewed tens of thousands of reels. That's why I decided to write a book from the perspective of somebody that actually does the hiring. Learn the exact formula to captivate and qualify you as the obvious artist for the job, how to build a reel that ranks high on YouTube and attracts studios to you. The best part is with this book, you can get it right now absolutely free. Whether you're in design, games, TV, or film, go over to alanmckay.com/myreel. Okay, welcome to a brand new episode. So earlier this week, I was interviewing Cinefex magazine. So I was speaking with two of the senior writers for Cinefex, diving into the history of visual effects and so many really insightful aspects of the past 40 years in visual effects, as well as special effects, makeup, miniatures, everything else as well. This, to me, is a really special episode, and I hope that you've enjoyed it so far. This is part 2 of this, and I want to continue on digging into a lot of really great stories and other insights that they share. Again, check out the show notes for this at alanmckay.com/171. And I'll also link to Cinefex magazine. I highly suggest you check out the latest episode, which covers Aquaman, Welcome to Marwen, and a lot of other really great films and other subject matter. So check that out. I want to keep this introduction fairly short so we can get right into it. So without further ado, here is Jody and Graham from Cinefex. Let's dive in. Just to kind of jump around a little bit, one thing that we talked about earlier was the development process for a lot of these issues. And one thing before we get into that I'm kind of curious about is with everything being online these days, I think it's definitely changed the immediacy of things. Like, people tend to go online and expect just to get access to everything so quickly. And even I found, like, SIGGRAPH, for instance, I feel like the attendance rates have dropped over the years because it's a lot easier just to go on like CG Channel or whatever website and read all about it, opposed to having to need to be there all the time. Do you find that, like, with the internet, like, it has caused a lot of shifts in terms of people's expectations and also, let's say, with the physical issues as well, like, do people tend to absorb it more online, like electronically?
It was something that really worried us for a while there, actually, because yes, it seemed like, how can we possibly be timely? How can we compete with something where somebody was shooting something for, The Dark Knight Rises in Chicago yesterday, and it's all over the internet the next day, and here are the rigs they were using, and it's like, how can we compete with that? And eventually, and we talked about changing the format of the magazine, maybe to try to, maybe if we do shorter articles and do more articles, and we could come out monthly and with little snippets and and which would have just been a complete change of what we do. And we finally decided that we were going to kind of be classic Coke, you know what I mean? That we were going to stick with our formula, even though it seemed, and does still seem sometimes like kind of a dinosaur formula in some ways. But we still do something that nobody else does. And there are people that still value that. And that is, like Graham mentioned, the soup to nuts thing. If you want the full story, I almost think of Cinefex as like kind of mini making of books in a way. And if you want that, you're going to have to wait a month or two for it. And that's just it. Rather than trying to compete with the internet, which we couldn't do anyway, as long as we're published. There's no way we can compete with it. We finally just realized, look, as long as we still have to write and interview and publish on paper and wait for the printing press and all of that, we cannot compete timing-wise with the internet. But what we can do is do a more thorough thing. So we do that more thorough thing, and people just wait for it, and they don't seem to mind waiting for it. Mm-hmm. That's been the surprise. I think it scared us a little bit that people would just completely reject that, but that has not been our experience. In fact, there have been a couple of times recently where we went back and covered something really late just because we felt like we should have, and for some reason it just kind of slipped through, like Wonder Woman. I don't remember how many months, do you, Graham, went by between Wonder Woman's release and when we finally covered it?
I think it was the best part of a year, Jody.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we didn't get a single, that I know of, we didn't get a complaint about that. It was like, hey, we should have covered this to begin with. We somehow let this one slip by, but it deserves coverage. So we went back and covered it, and it seemed to work out very well.
That's cool. That's really cool. And sorry, go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, the other thing I'd just add to that, which picks up on something you said at the top, Alan, is as someone who started out as a reader of Cinefex and now is in the wonderful position of writing for Cinefex, every article I approach, I genuinely remember that this is not just one article; it's actually part of the continuum of articles that makes up the ongoing collection that is Cinefex, that Don Shay began in 1980. And here we are in 2018 and it's still going. And in a funny sort of way, it all feels like one big issue to me that just gets bigger and bigger every couple of months. So every time I, sit down and say, okay, I'm covering this film next, I kind of just do a little reality check and think, well, this is just the next article in that sequence. And that knowledge alone, I think, I don't want to talk this up more than it deserves, but it does elevate it, in my opinion, from something more than just a single piece.
Right. There is a legacy aspect to it. We're kind of the magazine of record for what happened with visual effects and filmmaking between the years of 1980 and whenever. Going into the future. And so, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There's kind of, for people, they kind of want that collection that's kind of an encyclopedia in a way, Yeah. So that's a good point, Graham.
I think that you guys, like, again, I guess Don is the one to blame for this, but I think having such a unique design, having this weighted, like, heavy, solid magazine, I mean, it's done so great to kind of stand out as its own thing. Like I would never refer to it as a magazine. You know what I mean? And that's just it. Like if it was like a regular magazine, it'd be like, all right, get an issue here and there. But because it visually and physically feels very different to everything else, it kind of goes in its own category. So you kind of feel compelled, or at least I have, to get every issue to you treat it very differently to anything else. And I think because of that, you don't take it for granted, whereas you would with a magazine or something else like that. Instead, this is, as you said, a collector's item.
I doubt that there's anyone in the world who reads their issue of Cinefex and then throws it in the trash, like you do with your, People magazine or something. I don't think that happens. In fact, I just saw Richard Edlund at the VES Awards in February, and he said that he's got an entire bookcase that's just all of his Cinefexes, and he's going to have to get more bookcases, I guess, because it keeps going. And
that's cool. That's really cool. And I guess, like, I'm not sure if Don or anyone had this vision at all, but have you guys ever thought about, like, branching out, continuing the same formula you have, but doing video or things like that over the years, especially early on? Or has it always just been, we're going to stick to magazines? Just because, like, I felt like there was Movie Magic and a few shows like that back in the day that people, always were glued to. But obviously you guys have that formula. You're covering stuff so in depth. What would be the next step of that? Like, has there ever been thoughts or talk about, doing different things?
Well, this brings us to one of the key things about Cinefex, which is that you know how many magazines have closed over the last few years. I mean, it's well known that published magazines a lot of them have just had to quit. And one of the reasons we're still here is because literally it is 5 people who do this. That's not counting the advertising team, but the actual production. It's Greg Shea, the publisher, associate publisher Janine Peroy, myself, Graham, and Joe. And that is who produces. And then we also have he doesn't work for the company, but he's kind of a subcontractor, Jason, who does our color work and just does a phenomenal job with the typesetting and everything. So I guess I should say 6 people. And that is it. And that's why we're still here, because we don't have a big building. We don't have a huge staff. We don't, we are a very lean and mean machine, But because of that, to do anything else like videos or anything, sure, we've banted about those ideas before, but we don't have the staff to do it. And we're not willing to. We'd have to go into a whole different tier as a company to bring on the number of people we need to do something like that.
Right.
So for better or worse, I think we've decided we're going to continue doing what we do well in the way that we do it with our skeleton crew. And that just kind of puts the kibosh on any kind of video. We've talked about, wouldn't it be great when we interview the directors if we could videotape those interviews, but that would, think what that would take.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to both. I mean, you've got this working model, like why mess with it, But at the same time, the flip side is that you have access to so much great knowledge and you cover so much great knowledge that, it's like the icing on the cake would be all these other things. So yeah, I completely get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And in terms of, as you mentioned, like having such a very lean, mean team, what's it been like? Have you guys looked at hiring freelancers in the past? And in terms of what kind of pushed you to go in the direction of sticking with the core team? I think it's great because it means you get that consistency. You guys obviously live and breathe Cinefex and you know it better than anyone. But I'm kind of curious, have there been considerations of bringing outside forces or things like that over time?
Well, we went through a period. Don, wrote the first few issues with a little bit of help, outside help. And then then I started writing and was, I guess, head writer. I guess you're head writer if you're the only writer. So with freelancers, we kind of went through a few years there of trying that. It was, I could say from my perspective, since I was the one dealing with them, it was an often frustrating experience because the same thing, it almost became comical. The same thing would happen over and over and over again. I'd get an email from a usually young, sometimes not so young, writer saying, I would love to write for Cinefex and I don't have a byline yet. And because we were small, we were a good place for someone to get their first byline. And so we'd say, okay, and I'd meet that person for lunch and I'd look at their writing samples and I'd say the same thing every time. I could see from your writing samples that you can write. But what I don't know from your writing samples is if you can meet a deadline and if you can be disciplined, and I'm not going to be looking over your shoulder and breathing down your neck all the time. Are you self-directed enough to do this? Also, most people who write articles, they're used to writing, 2,000 words maybe? 500 words? These are 8,000 to 10,000 word articles. It's a whole different thing. It is. Yeah. It's a very different thing. So I would lay that out and they'd swear on their mother's lives, oh yes, I'll do it. I promise this means more to me than anything. And time after time after time, they wouldn't meet even their first deadline. I'd say, okay, I want all your transcripts by such and such date. Wouldn't meet that deadline. Oh, I'm sorry. the dog got into the tapes. I mean, literally, someone said that to me once, believe it or not.
Wow.
So it became, our experience with freelancers was not a happy one. Let's just say that, because that happened more times than I can count. We got a few exceptions. Mark Voss, who's gone on to write many books and is, was an exception and wrote for us often. And then we found Joe Fordham, who started off as a freelancer and was tremendously disciplined and a fantastic writer. And once we found someone like that, we said, well, we're not going to let this guy go. And we hired him. And that was, I think, oh gosh, Joe will be mad if I scoop, but I think 15 years ago, or gosh, maybe even closer to 20 now. It's kind of a blur, Alan. And when we found Joe, and then for the longest time, Joe and I just wrote every article until we found Graham, and then just brought Graham on like 5 years ago. So I could say in the almost 40 years, and really more like 30, that I've been in this position, it's like Joe and Graham are the only two we found that were so good and so able to do it and so disciplined and could actually meet a deadline that we hired them, that they became, and then now I just don't even take solicitations from freelancers anymore. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer, but
no, I think it's great.
Yeah. So yeah, that was not a happy experience. It was I rewrote more. Oh my goodness. Because then I'd have a week, by the time they turned in something. By the way, I actually had a freelancer solicit me once, and what they sent me as their writing sample was my own Terminator 2 article.
Oh yeah, I've had my demo reel sent to my company before.
That never happened to. And I called her and said, really interesting that the writing sample you sent is my article that I wrote. So not only was she a cheat, but she also was so lazy, she didn't even stop to look at who wrote the article and who she was sending her writing sample to, so that didn't go well.
So amazing.
Yeah. So we're happy to have our little band of writers now. It's great. Joe and Graham and I are really work together well and have each other's backs, and it works out very well. And I think Graham will verify this, after giving them a deadline and their assignment, they really don't necessarily hear from me until they turn it in, so they're very much their own independent workers.
I like it. That's cool. And I guess just to kind of touch base on that, I mean, what would it take for someone to qualify to actually make it into the company, like to write freelance for you guys? I'm just curious about that because, again, I think that as you've put in time to kind of disclose like what hasn't worked, I mean, I'm kind of curious, like what are the things that you would look for, or what are the things you found to be, I guess, surefire signs as to like, this person is not going to make it or not going to be able to qualify for like what we're looking for as a writer?
Well, as a writer, see, that's the thing. There are a lot of really good writers, and especially now. See, one of the problems in the old days was you had people who understood the technology and were film buffs and had all of that knowledge set, and then you had people who could write, but you didn't necessarily get those two things in one thing. I mean, a CG supervisor back in the old days of ILM, for instance, they could spin circles around me as far as their understanding of the technology and everything, but it didn't mean they were necessarily writers or storytellers. So that was hard. I think it'd be easier now, actually, to find people who could do both, because I think just so many more people understand it. We now have a generation or two that's kind of grown up in this technology. So finding writers who get it would be a lot easier now. I don't really think I think we're pretty much staffed up and we're happy with the way it is. I don't see us expanding or using freelancers, but you never know. If Graham wants to take a sabbatical or something, we can talk to the freelance world.
Just to add to that, I think as someone who had written for many years before starting at Cinefex, I can confidently say it's the hardest job. It's simultaneously the most difficult and the most rewarding job I've ever had, because the information that we gather initially, because we're not just writers, of course, we're research journalists. We going into a project, we may know very, very little about it. So there's a whole raft of interviewing and research that has to be done beforehand. So, and for a typical article, I don't know about you, Jody, but I'll easily end up with 40,000 words of transcript, usually more.
Yes.
And just wrangling that logistically is a big job.
Yeah.
Then you have to tease out the information that's relevant to our mission. Is it going to be interesting to the readers? And is there a story here? Jody has a background in theatre. Joe and I both have backgrounds in film and narrative storytelling as well. We like to think of ourselves as well as storytellers. It's not enough just to. We're not writing shopping lists, we're not itemizing what was done. We're actually trying to find a thread and trying to tell an interesting story, and juggling all those things and doing it to an incredibly tight deadline is just a case of keeping a lot of plates spinning at the same time. Writing is perhaps 25% of it.
Yeah, no, you guys kind of hinted towards that earlier. I mean, obviously, collecting the information is one thing, but then you obviously got to find that hook, try and find the key themes that come with it. And in a way, it's kind of like telling, actually, yeah, you said it yourself, like telling a story. Like if you want to touch base on this, like what is the overall like bird's eye view process from soup to nuts? From the beginning to end. I mean, obviously identifying which films ahead of time too, which is always tricky. And then trying to figure out, well, which ones are, do you have access to during the process? Do you guys mind like walking through how you would initially pick a movie and then all the way through that journey to print?
Sure.
Graham?
Shall I take a run at that, Jody?
Sure.
Well, as we've sort of hinted, there's a lot of moving parts. If we're going to cover a film, we have to consider what's the release date, what's the delivery date, who's the studio, and who are the filmmakers. But of course, over and above that, we have to ask, is this a film we want to cover? Is this a film that we want to see in Cinefex and that we think our readers will want to see? So there's that. There's also our publication schedule. We publish every 2 months, and that has a very complex set of moving parts attached to that in terms of when we have copy deadlines, when we have review deadlines, art deadlines, print deadlines, all the rest of it. So it's like clockwork. It's like all these different gears moving together to get everything to coincide. So the way we treat that is every month we'll have an editorial meeting, which we'll do on a regular basis, and we'll talk these things through. So we're planning usually 2 or 3 issues ahead, and we've usually got a good idea of what's going to happen a year ahead. That always changes because, as you know, Alan, release dates always change, and delivery dates frequently change. And this film may be finished, but suddenly it's sitting on ice for 6 months for various reasons.
Stereo conversion. That's like the one thing I'm going to throw in there, that like the amount of films I've had that got delayed by a year or more just because they decided. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Absolutely. So we frequently have to do a lot of juggling, even for the issue that we're working on at the time. We've started articles, and for whatever reason, we've had to pull the plug because a date's changed or because a permission's been denied. So editorial meetings decide the content. On a good issue, we make our decisions, we make our choices. Jody will, between us, we'll divide up who's going to write what. Generally, Jody will do 1 article per issue. Joe and I will alternate 2 articles or 1 article per issue on a kind of turnabout basis. Sometimes we'll do 5 articles. That's for a 4 article issue, which is our average. Sometimes we'll do 5, and we'll just divvy those up as we need to. Then each writer will reach out initially to the studio, because without studio permission, we can't do a thing. So studio publicity department is the first point of call. Generally, these are people that we know well. We've written articles for films that they've distributed before. So we're usually talking to people who understand what we do and who know what our needs are. So with a bit of luck, and usually we'll get approval in a fairly timely fashion. From there, the next step is to compile a list of interviewees. That's based partly on ongoing research and ear to the ground that we've been doing over previous months as we look ahead to what films we think we're going to be covering at this point. So we know who the key supervisors are. We know who the key companies are, and we'll start reaching out to them. But inevitably, as soon as you start talking to perhaps the visual effects producer, might be one of the first calls we'll make. They'll say, "Oh yeah, did you know we had another 6 vendors on this show?" And we're like, "Okay, I've just doubled my interview list then." So we will schedule all those interviews, and it depends on the show, really. I mean, it's probably rare that I do fewer than 10 interviews for an article. For a big Marvel Studios show, let's say that could go up to say 20. I think the most I've done is something like 27 or 28, which just got crazy. But we're talking about a lot of interviews, which are generally done over the phone or sometimes in person or Skype. All that interview material then has to be transcribed, which, as I said, is many tens of thousands of words of material. And then once that's done, we sit and take it apart and put it all back together in a creative way. That's when it goes smoothly. Often you'll find that you have to start writing before you've finished interviewing, simply because time's running out. We always try and get the director, which I think, Jody, we've done consistently well over the past few years, actually. I think it's rare that we've got an issue without at least 2 or 3 articles where we've interviewed the director. Those often come towards the end of the schedule.
We've got a pretty good batting average there on that recently, yeah.
And then the key really to what we do is that once the article's written, Joe and I will send our articles through to Jody. Jody will edit them, and then we send them out for review. So the final draft of the article goes back out to all the key people we've interviewed, and we ask them to read it and check the facts and tell us if we've got anything wrong. And that's where we, tie up the loose ends. Where somebody said in an interview, "Oh yeah, that camera ran at 25,000 frames a second for that slow motion shot," and then maybe we've checked it out because we're double checking as we go along we're saying, "Oh well, that Phantom." We're just looking at the spec sheet for that Phantom, and did it really go that fast? And someone will say, "Oh no, actually it was 20,000. It wasn't 25." So all those things hopefully get picked up at review stage, and I think we have a pretty good track record for getting it right. A few things slip through, but the review process picks up a lot of them.
But you're right, like especially when you haven't seen the film and you are being thrown so many technical terms and you're trying to put it all in context. Like, obviously this magazine is all about the facts, and that's obviously going to be like a tricky thing to be able to decipher all the technobabble and then be able to also verify all of it as well. So yeah, I mean it sounds like a monster process. I'm so surprised at how much of a skeleton crew you guys have to be able to manage so much, especially movies like Marvel films where you have so many vendors, like the whole film's pretty much CG.
And that's just the writing side of it too, Alan. At that point, it goes into production, and that's a whole other thing. And that's what Janine and Greg do. And Greg, lays out the articles. Janine gathers all the imagery, which is a huge job now. You're dealing with all these different, if a Marvel production has 20 vendors on it, that's 20 vendors that have to submit artwork to the studio for approval, and then they go through all of those. So that's a huge job. There's the typesetting part of it. There's the printing part of it. Greg does all the layouts. There's caption writing then that has to happen, and something Don set up from the beginning, which I've always teased him, was because Cinefex wasn't quite hard enough. So let's see if there's a way to make it a little bit harder. Our captions are never just 1 or 2 line ID captions. Our captions are almost like the abridged version of the article. So that's a whole other thing, writing the captions for the articles. It's a huge thing. Everything is proofread by me and also by Janine. And Don still gets all the articles just to kind of do his little, thing with. He's still got emeritus status around here. So, but so we've got a lot of eyes on it, which is why when a typo like that, it's unbelievable. Janine just noticed that we had the moon landing date wrong in one line in the first man article, which would have been mortifying to all of us, especially Joe, I'm sure, since he wrote it. But thank goodness she caught it. I mean, we had we had it like in June or something. We had a completely wrong date. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, a lot of eyes are on it, and there's a lot of work that happens even once the articles are done. That's just the main point I wanted to make. And then, of course, it goes to the presses, and we're very, very picky about the press runs. If there's one little thing, it's got to be redone. Very picky about the color, I've always said Cinefex is a harsh mistress.
It sounds like a monster process to go through. I mean, again, just the data gathering is one part of it. And I guess that's why when it comes to hiring people and having that expectation of output, I mean, once you've gathered all this data to be able to then turn it into something else, and as you said, like go through every iteration, every part of the process, it's huge. It's really impressive.
That's why for all of my freelancer bashing I did earlier, I really should say it is a lot to expect someone to do. I mean, it is a lot. That's why when we found a couple of people who could actually do it, we, chained them to their desks and did not let them get away.
Yeah, and the other thing, I am in fact now chained to my desk.
Yeah.
Yes. I suppose just the one last thing to add to that, Alan, is the timescale. We publish an issue every 2 months, which in theory is 8 weeks. In practice, it means we've got about 6 weeks to do all that in terms of editorial. I mean, and so you can imagine if we're setting out at the beginning of that, and the studio's saying, "Oh yeah, can you just give us a week to think about this?" Suddenly, I've got 5 weeks because I can't do a thing until I've got that approval.
Right.
And then the approval comes through the middle of the next week, so I've lost another half week. And oh, by the way, Venom is a good example. I just wrote the Venom article for our October issue, and the poor guys at DNEG were still. I was interviewing in August. The poor guys were still 3 months out from delivery. They of course they wanted to talk to me. I mean, they couldn't have been more gracious, and Paul Franklin couldn't have been more gracious about taking time. But these guys are seriously up to their necks in the work. So I'm there on the phone saying, "So how did you do that shot?" And they're saying, "We haven't done that shot yet."
Yeah. Sometimes, I can't remember the name of the movie. What was the name of the movie that with Will Smith where he had to kill his dog because his dog got infected with the...
Oh, yeah, I Am Legend.
What was it?
I Am Legend. I think Sony did all the work on that, right?
So, yeah. In that case, because we had to start so early and we're done with the article and it was already in production and already printed, and they had completely changed the ending of the movie. So the ending we have in our article is not the ending that they actually had in the movie, which when we sat there and watched the movie, we were like, uh-oh.
I actually preferred the alternate ending a lot more. It's just one of those things that actually made sense to the film quite a lot more than the Hollywood ending they went with. That's
another way that the digital world has impacted us, because back in the old days, not to sound like one of those people that says that, back in the old days, just for them to have time to make all the film prints they needed to make, a movie had to be locked about 3 months before its release date, which means that movie was done. There was no change in the ending. There was no change in anything. Well, of course, now they don't have to make film prints and send them out to 2,000 theaters or anything. So it is remarkable how close to the release date we find they're still tinkering. Those movies, they're tinkering with those things. I think they're tinkering with them as people are lining up to buy their tickets. I mean, unbelievable, which changes really late. So anyway, that's really changed things for us, because they're still, like Graham said, they could say, well, we haven't finished that shot yet. We don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I was just going to say, like, I've been called in to like redo endings of movies 3 weeks before the movie's coming out, you know, and it's so funny watching like all the movie trailers. And for most people, the trailer you might see on TV or hear on the radio, that's meant to get people excited. And for you, it's like the impending doom of, you know, you see a bus go by with a poster on, and it's just like, okay, stop reminding me, like I'm running out of time. Like, so yeah, it's pretty amazing how it has shifted in that way that, you know, before it would need to get printed and distributed, and these days because it's all digital, you can kind of leave it to, I think, like 2 or 3 weeks can be the cutoff. You know, it's scary.
Yeah. They can actually distribute their movies a lot faster than we can distribute our magazines. So we're still kind of on the old, you know, it takes us a lot of time to do this, and they can meanwhile be, you know, messing with it clear up to the end. You're right.
I think it was, now I recall, like Weta, the second Hobbit, I remember talking with those guys, like, oh, how's it all going? It's like they had 5 days before the movie came out, and they had 500 shots still untouched. And, you know, which I thought was phenomenal, just the fact that they hadn't touched 500 shots and nothing was at 48 frames a second, which is what, actually it would have been Hobbit 1, yeah, because that was like the whole backbone about it being the first movie to go out at 48 FPS, and they managed to actually turn it all around. And that's the impressive part about Weta, is like they have the infrastructure there to perform those miracles. So going through the process, I mean, obviously that's been huge to discuss, like the whole production process. I mean, I guess the whole scope being so big, I mean, have you guys always, like, what would be the typical turnaround? Because obviously you've also got to juggle multiple issues. I imagine you're not just black and white doing one issue at a time, but you're lining things up, which can triple the amount of work you guys are doing. But are you typically going through a machine of doing multiple issues at a time, like if you can get ahead on them?
Well, maybe in research and background stuff, maybe, but see, because we can't really do anything till the studio gives the okay. And we have to be very judicious about contacting the studio publicity departments. If we contact them too early to get their okay for something, their red flags go up. They get very nervous. You know how nervous the whole industry is now about secrets getting out and all of that. And that's a whole other story. And, you know, so, you know, we can't, 6 months before the next Star Wars movie is coming out, we cannot contact the studio and say, hey, is it okay if we start talking to people about, they will, their heads will explode, right? Because they are just very, very nervous about any secrets getting out. So we have to be judicious about that and really careful about when we approach them. So as much as I'd like to say we kind of have multiple issues going at one time, we can't really, because as it is, we're asking them. I mean, like, we're doing interviews for our December issue right now. Now, to the studios, December is a million years from now, right? But from their perspective, for us, we need that much time to get this done for the December issue, because all the editorial has to be done by, about the middle of October, anywhere from the middle to the end of the month. Editorial has to be completely done to give production the time they need to do all of their side of it and get it out on the street by mid-December. So, the studio, a lot of times they'll ask us, why do you have to start so early? It's like, Entertainment Weekly doesn't start this early. Well, Entertainment Weekly is doing an 800-word puff piece on Tom Cruise. I mean, if we were doing that, we wouldn't have to start so early either. But for what we do, we have to have a couple of months to do it.
Yeah, so, Jody's absolutely right. But much as we publish one issue at a time, we do occasionally find ourselves in editorial writing more than one article at a time. So if I remember, I think it was, where are we? I'm just looking at it now. Issue 150, that's right. I was writing Arrival and Allied, and the timing worked out such that, the timescales got a little bit compressed for all the reasons I explained earlier. So I was kind of interviewing and writing for both articles at more or less the same time. Unfortunately, they're both single-word titles. They both begin with the letter A. Allied is ALL, Arrival is ARR. So I'm just staring. You can imagine, it's late at night. I've just done a ton of interviews. I've maybe interviewed someone for Arrival, then someone for Allied. I've been asking someone how the aliens got on board the Lancaster bomber in the Second World War. I'm looking at the folders. The titles of the folders both look identical. I can't work out where to put the audio file. It can get a little bit hairy sometimes.
Yeah. I think everyone's going to have a huge appreciation for all the blood, sweat, and tears you guys put into Cinefex. I guess with fake scripts being an issue these days too, or more of a common thing that's starting to happen a lot more, especially with Disney. It's kind of tricky too that, especially post houses, who are not typically involved in the narrative as much. Like what they're being told in terms of what's happening in the story might not be entirely accurate, and I'm sure that could trickle down when they're referring to certain things too, if the movie isn't out yet and you're taking everything that's being said at their word.
Well, also under the umbrella of, in the good old days, they used to give us scripts, believe it or not. And the script was actually final. It wasn't being tampered with. So we have a script. And then when the studio started balking at actually giving us a script, we had other means to get them that shall remain nameless until we're in our graves. But you can't do that anymore. And they're kind of meaningless anyway, because, just because that's what the script says doesn't mean that's what the final movie's going to be. So that resource has gone out, is kind of out the door. I think the statute of limitations is passed, so I can admit this, but I was writing a book about the Phantom Menace, I believe. I'm making a book. And as is usual, they allowed me to come. I was actually staying up at Skywalker's Ranch to go through some of their tapes from the set and everything. And they let me have the script and said that I could have it and read it in my room at night. And then I had to turn it in the next morning. But I knew, no matter how much I tried to take notes, how do you write a making of book about a movie if you don't know if you don't have script? Just the names of all the characters. And even if I'd stayed up all night, I couldn't make exact enough notes to really make it. So I actually snuck off to a Kinko's in San Rafael and stood there. And I have never been so scared in my life. I honestly thought stormtroopers were going to come. But I made a copy of the script. God, I hope no one kills me for this, because I knew I would have to have it. I referred to that thing constantly, but I also kept it under lock and key. I guarded it like it was my life, because I was scared to death, because that would have been that. But I knew I had to have it. I couldn't write a making of book if I did not know what was in this movie. So, that's my big confession of that's my lifetime right there.
They're knocking on your door right now. Well, I guess it was for the greater good, right? So.
Well, it was, and I was right, and I referred to it 100 times a day, so I couldn't have done it without it. I understand, but, no secrets got out because of me, that's for sure, so.
I actually have an interview with Terrell Whitlatch, who helped design Jar Jar Binks, coming out next week, which was kind of fun, just kind of talking about, the number one most hated CGI character in history. Yeah, that's so cool that you've got that history as well to of going through all these pretty iconic films. I've got one or two more questions, but one I figured would be fun to ask would be for both of you. Are there any fond stories or things like that of interviews with filmmakers or during the production process that you guys were going through that you can think back on?
I think my most special one happened fairly recently, actually. Like I had mentioned earlier that I was in the black box for The Lion King. And Jon Favreau wanted to show me some of the footage that they had. And so we went into the screening room. And, all the handlers, the people that were there, like the PR person, everything, wound up sitting a few rows back from us. We were in the front row of this little screening room. Probably because they thought, well, this isn't really an interview. I didn't have my tape recorder on or anything. We were just going to look at footage. And we both wound up kind of slouching down in our theater seats there in the screening room. And Jon Favreau and I talked for probably over an hour about everything, about filmmaking and about, I wish my recorder had been on. I don't know what I used it for exactly, because it wasn't all about Lion King. But I had the most astonishing amazing. You know how you can look back on your life, you've got maybe 5 conversations you've had with someone where it just was so amazing and it went longer than you expected and it got into deeper things than you ever expected. And that's what this was like. You know, he's funny. He says his idea of directing is talking. You know, that's what he thinks directing is anyway, because he's a good talker, you know. And we had just one of the most incredible conversations I've ever had with another human being. It just happened to be him. So that will remain a very fond memory for me.
I've heard nothing but great things like from everyone who's worked with him. Yeah, I mean, he seems like such a great guy, and obviously he's got an amazing amount of films to back that up as well. So that's great. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What about you, Graham?
I guess mine would be a director interview too. I covered Shape of Water last year, and had an interview lined up with Guillermo del Toro.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by that point I'd spoken to pretty much everybody else. I'd spoken to the guys at Legacy Effects, who created the Amphibian Man suit, and Mr. X, who did the visual effects, and even Doug Jones, the actor who's inside the suit, because it was clear to me that the story, again, this comes back to finding the story for the article. The story was clearly putting the Amphibian Man on the screen. So I spoke to everybody involved there. I had the interview lined up with Guillermo, and it was fairly late in the evening, my time. He was on the other side of the world. But all through that day, I'd been seeing these awful stories about the earthquake in Mexico that had happened that very day. And I'm thinking, as well as thinking, oh, gee, this is terrible news, I'm thinking, well, you know, Guillermo's maybe not going to want to talk to me, because I'd seen on his Twitter feed he'd been up all night, literally retweeting stuff about the disaster, putting people in touch with each other, disseminating information about it. He basically literally spent the entire night acting as a public service for his home country. I thought, I'm just going to get a call or an email soon saying, I'm so sorry, Guillermo, can't talk to you. Can we reschedule? Right. But no, I got a call saying, Guillermo's just slightly delayed. Can we just give us half an hour? So I gave him half an hour. The phone rang, and there's Guillermo. And I started the call, obviously, just by expressing my sympathy for the disaster. And we just talked a little bit about that. And then we moved on to Shape of Water, and he spoke eloquently, passionately, intelligently, creatively for 45 minutes about this wonderful film, which by that point I'd already seen and personally fallen in love with. And it was just the most delightful interview by this amazing filmmaker who had just, you know, experienced something really quite traumatic in his life. And I thought, well, if that's not a sign of someone who's willing to talk to us and willing to share his craft, then I don't know what is.
That's so cool. That's great. Yeah, I mean, you know, it shows a lot of dedication right there to your work and to your passion. Yeah, it's really amazing.
I would actually want to add, though, that the other kind of conversation, I was entrusted with writing the history of the Stan Winston studio. When Stan, I did not know this. Actually, very few people knew this, but Stan was very, very ill. And I wrote this Winston Effect, which is, you know, a nice big coffee table book about the art and history of the Stan Winston studio. And number one, just the honor that, you know, it was that he chose me to do that. Stan chose me personally to do that. Mm-hmm. And in order for that book, I actually just got a hotel room in Van Nuys, which is where the studio was, and just went to the studio every day and talked to him for hours and hours for 3 or 4 days in a row. And I remember he would say he was tired, and I can remember even thinking, oh my gosh, Stan, I only have 4 days to get this entire history here. But he'd need to take a break. And of course, afterwards, I understood why, because he was so ill. It was not clear to me that he was. And so that's certainly, those 4 days sitting in his office with Stan Winston was a real honor. And the fact that the book got done before he died, and it meant so much to him, and he was so happy with it. He'd call me every day because I'd send him chapters as I wrote it. And he'd call me and say, "Oh, I just read this chapter." And, Stan was a very effusive human being. And so that's a very special place in my heart, too. So some people, it's not only that they're brilliant, but they're just really great interviews. Like, I don't know if you found this, Graham, but I think Jeff Oken is a fantastic interview. He's fun. He's very spirited, or he was when I talked to him. And
I think Jeff's quite a good call for a good interview. Certainly, I spoke to him for my Alpha article this year, and I think I've probably got as many quotes from him that I can't use for various reasons.
He's a good guy. I like him.
As quotes that I can.
Yeah. They are remarkably open with this. This is something that is always very nice because we've been around so long and we have never, we are just the facts, man. We are the dragnet of, this stuff. So we're not looking for gossip. I mean, goodness knows I have been told things or have been present for things that would make really juicy stories, but we don't do that. We're not there.
Cinefex, not TMZ.
Yes, exactly. And because we've always had a lot of integrity about that and we have never double-crossed anybody, I'm always kind of touched and by how open so many of them are with us. They tell us a lot that they know if they say, well, you won't write about this. And no, we won't. Which is really a nice position to be in. I always tease people and say, when we're doing what we know is the last issue of Cinefex, then we're going to
going to end a lot of careers. I don't know. I look at the movie making process and I look at how it was for me growing up, and I'm sure all of us like watching Willow and all these other really E.T. You name it, and it was magical. It was kind of like this. You get pulled into this thing where, at least for me, like everyone has their Star Wars and Terminator story. If they saw that, then they knew that that's what they wanted to do. And I was naive enough to not, like, I was just trying to enjoy the film, just like I force myself to do these days. But it wasn't like, wow, how did they do that? But for me, like I definitely found that was a pretty amazing journey to watch like all these iconic films that as you're going through it, because it was a new experience every time. And I'm just kind of curious for both of you, like what your opinion is of now, whether you feel like maybe people are they take it for granted perhaps, or they're not going to be as mesmerized. Maybe they're more desensitized to the experience and like what they're being taken through compared to how we would have been, watching movies growing up.
I'm not convinced things have changed so much in some ways. I think attention spans have changed, which means that the way the younger generations absorb narrative storytelling, shall we say, have changed. But I'm not sure that the rest of it has. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, Ray Harryhausen Dynamation scene, that was state of the art, and that wowed audiences. And then you roll forward 2001 and the original Star Wars, then Jurassic Park, and then through to the sort of the super sophisticated visuals that we see today. Every generation's exposed to something more sophisticated than the previous generation. But I don't know. I think the key to it is always storytelling, isn't it? It's the spectacle changes, the nature of the spectacle changes, and the reaction that the audience has to the spectacle changes. But the story is still the story, and that's the thing that people take away. It's kind of a hoary old cliche, it's all about the story, and it's certainly something that we're always being told in interview. But it's a cliche because it's true. And the visual effects and the special effects are just there they are just the illusion, aren't they? And you don't want people to notice them.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. No, yeah, you answered that perfectly.
I probably have a slightly different perspective just because I'm older. It's true. And I'm not the demographic for these movies. I mean, nobody is out there making a visual effects movie for, women in their 60s, let's face it. So I always try to keep that in mind, that I'm not the demographic for these movies. I try to look at it that way, recognizing that. I do think people would be surprised, given how critical people are in comments online and stuff about movies, how much effort does go in to tell a story. They really do. They all care about that. I've never talked to a filmmaker or even a visual effects person, who you would think maybe that's not. They're all about how do we tell this story. But I do think the eye candy is kind of a distraction from story sometimes, or something, a placeholder for a story sometimes. That, if you can wow them, maybe they won't notice that the story maybe isn't as solid as it could be. But again, like I said, this is coming from someone, they don't make those movies for me. So I would have to somehow transform into a 18-year-old young man, I think, to really have the right perspective on this. And, so that's all I can say about that.
No, I get it. Yeah, and I think there was like definitely phases in time, like you look at movies like Twister, certain things like that. I mean, it is kind of more about, let's do a movie on this and we'll wrap a story around it. And obviously there's no protagonist, so we'll make it dramatic and they'll deal with their issues. And, so I think that there definitely were phases in filmmaking where the reasoning behind a movie getting greenlit was, let's do an asteroid coming towards Earth and we'll grab a script to throw at it.
Right.
And now that like all of that is possible, it isn't so much about that. But at the same time, you're right. Like, I've always appreciated like less is more. I've mentioned this before, but M. Night Shyamalan, like I found like there's one film I worked on with him where I met him, and he was talking about The Sixth Sense, and for him, your imagination is way more scary than anything he can make, and that always resonated with me enough that I do kind of mention it a lot, just because I do think with what we do, sometimes there is that moment of showing too much just because we can, and sometimes like by not showing it, that would be a lot more intriguing. So sometimes because now we can do all these things, we just kind of take it for granted and do it, whereas keeping it more minimal would be more effective.
I go back to Jurassic Park, and I guess this is the best way to say what I think about this. You look at Jurassic Park now, and, they could do those dinosaurs a lot better now, for goodness.
Still holds up.
Yeah, but it holds up. But the reason it holds up is because the story is there. So you can get by with lesser technology if the story is there, but you can't get by with lesser story just because the technology's there, if I could make that dichotomy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You don't care at all that, and I think that's probably why a lot of the Harryhausen stuff, people still love watching that and still do to this day, because we can see that's a little stroby or whatever, but it doesn't matter because the filmmaking is there and the story is there, the tension is there, and all of those things. So to the degree they think that the wow pizzow stuff is going to make up for there not being a story there, it doesn't seem to work. But I sure have never talked to anyone who said, story, we didn't care about that. That never happens. They care tremendously. And the amount of effort that goes in for even a single shot to tell a story, it's very important to them.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so cool.
And I think the one, just to add to that, the one thing that maybe the next phase with visual effects, we talk about the industry maturing. Certainly one of the trends, of course, is to things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and efficiencies and automation and all the rest of it. It's possible that the democratization of the technology and the image making process is actually going to open up sophisticated visuals and spectacle and the ability to put anything you want on the screen to small independent productions with young, hungry filmmakers who perhaps don't care about hitting a wide demographic and getting a worldwide release, but they want to tell their extraordinary story. That could only be told by visual effects, but which has a unique, creative, strange, whatever you want, angle to it that a mainstream movie wouldn't ever dare go near. But these guys, with their tiny budget and their enthusiasm, can now do, because the visual effects technology is suddenly accessible to them.
Yeah.
I love that. I wasn't going to ask this, but I'll ask. My final question would be, touching on what you just mentioned, which is like, what do you think are some of the predictions you have, not necessarily for technology specifically, but for the industry and how we tell stories like down the line? Obviously, there's been so many shifts, and I think that you guys having access and being a fly on the wall to so many conversations with filmmakers and kind of where things are going, like, what do you think are some of the predictions you expect for the future, whether it's a year from now or 20 years from now? And I'm not asking easy questions with my final question.
You
brought it up. I was going to leave this alone, but
yeah. No, if we knew that, Jody, I think we could hang up our Cinefex hats and get a very, very lucrative income from the film studios. But I mean, people talk about virtual reality being, if you like, the next step of storytelling. Personally, I'm not so sure. I mean, if you're talking about the future of storytelling, again, I'm not convinced that changes. You know, it's whether it's a theatre show or the written word or a film or a TV series that people binge watch.
Well, you touch base on machine learning, things like that too. So, I mean, even if it is more specifically like how some of the tools might become easier or more automated in certain ways, however it might be, or ILMX Lab, like what they're doing with, integrating virtual filmmaking as being more seamless.
Well, certainly. I mean, as Jody's already said with regard to The Lion King, that's a great example of how virtual production is just taking filmmaking into areas that couldn't have been conceived a few years ago, and it's also filtering down into relatively small productions too. The collaboration tools that we talked about, extending workflows, kind of globally. I think digital characters, people talk about the digital human, don't they, and the old uncanny valley. Personally, I don't think we're quite there yet, certainly not for, to put a character on screen for the duration of a feature. So I think there's still an awful lot of people out there, trying to get their hands on that particular holy grail.
That's great.
At some point, too, I wonder if there is a limit to what we as human beings can really, we're visceral creatures. We need a sense of groundedness and that we can smell something and see something and hear something, that even if it's on a screen, that it's real. I don't know how far we can go into a world of zeros and ones and really have it affect us in the same. I always think of this example. You know how in the old James Bond movies, one of the most fun things about going to the new James Bond movie was there'd always be this big stunt sequence at the beginning. And you always knew that stunt guys did that. Stunt guys skied, jumped off that helicopter and skied down that mountain. And, and to some extent in the back of your mind, you knew somebody actually did that. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't know, no matter how brilliantly you can recreate that in the digital world, I don't know if it resonates with people in quite the same way when you know that that's a digi-double and that that's a digital environment and a digital ski slope and a digital helicopter. I don't know if it hits us at the kind of primal level that we're not even conscious of in the same way. I don't know. That's a big question mark to me. But I do think in the same way that people are now kind of longing for, LPs played on phonographs. And I think there is a bit of a yearning for, I want something real. I want a real friend, not a Facebook friend. I want a real experience. And I want to see a movie that I know has been made with some reality to it. And again, maybe my lousy demographic speaking, but I do wonder about that.
I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think that we get desensitized a little bit to too much artificialness, and at the same time, it's one of those things that, like you appreciate. I mean, I watched Stand By Me the other day. It's just like one of those movies, and obviously, like, it's more than nostalgia, but like you're not thinking about how did they pull that off, or what was that thing. It's like you're enjoying a movie for the sake of it being a movie, and not having that kind of invisible cutaway to however they're going to pull it off digitally. It's on screen, and you don't have to worry about you take it all for granted for what it is, So I think it's great.
We did a thing on the blog a couple of years ago where everybody on the staff just wrote a little thing about what their favorite, movie of the year was, with the implication that it was going to be a visual effects movie, since that's what we do. And I was like, well, oh no, my favorite movie was Begin Again. Not a visual effect inside. So I had to kind of put on my Cinefex Editor's hat there. Okay, now get your mind off of other kinds of movies and into visual effects movies, of which many I love. I loved In the Heart of the Sea, by the way, mentioned earlier. I loved that movie. Yeah. So
that's cool. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Where can people go to find out more about Cinefex and all the things you guys are doing?
We have a website, cinefex.com, and you can pretty much get everything there. The blog can be accessed there, right, Graham?
Yep, absolutely. And you can also subscribe to the magazine. You can buy the latest issue. You can buy any back issue that's available, except for the ones that are out of print, of course. But there's still an awful lot still available through the website. And also the iPad edition, of course. We publish the print edition, but the iPad edition goes out at the same time. You can access that through the website or just through the iTunes store. Just search for Cinefex. And that's essentially, if the articles are the same text, we can fit a ton more pictures into the iPad because the iPad is essentially bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And we also have video content as well. So, for example, with our issue 160 this year, we got exclusive demo breakdown from ILM for Solo, and exclusive breakdown from Marvel Studios for Ant-Man and the Wasp. So there's always something extra to see there.
That's really cool. I think smart people are going to subscribe to both the electronic and the physical, so you can get one right away, you can carry anywhere, and you still get your collector's item. That's so cool. And the latest episode covers Battle Angel. What are the other films?
December is Fantastic Beasts, Welcome to Marwen, Aquaman, and Alita.
Cool.
Yeah, that's going to be a real good one.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really great. And I appreciate you guys taking the time to chat about everything. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Alan. You've been great.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. It's been great fun.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Again, thanks to Jody and Graham for taking the time out to chat. I think that this episode was easily one of my favorites. And again, just everything that we got into, it's been such an honor to be a part of this. And again, I want to thank both of them for the opportunity to do this episode. Now, like I said, if you haven't listened to the previous episode, part 1, check out alanmckay.com/170. In addition to that, the show notes for this episode is 171, so alanmckay.com/171. Finally, I'll be back next week. I'm interviewing Aaron Denner, who's one of the VFX soups at Brainstorm Digital in New York City, talking about his whole career and how he got to where he is as a visual effects supervisor. There's a lot of really great insights that we get into there as well. So lots more coming. In the meantime, definitely check out the latest episode of Cinefex magazine. I think we all should have a few piles of these on our desk, just for reference and inspiration and something to read while we're burning the renders at midnight. So that being said, I'll be back next episode with Aaron Denner. Until then, rock on.